Hello everyone, I am Dr. Deepa. Today we will learn about the muscles of the tongue. As we have already discussed about the gross features of the tongue, the presenting parts in the previous video, we will look onto the muscles, the blood supply, the nerve supply and the clinical importance of the tongue in this video for today. Firstly, to begin with the muscles of the tongue, as we all know, it is a muscular organ. The muscles of the tongue is divided into two categories. There are of two categories. Number one is called as the extrinsic group of muscles and the second is called as the intrinsic group of muscles. So there are extrinsic and intrinsic group of muscle. The extrinsic muscles, they are mainly involved in altering the position of the tongue. So the position of the tongue is mainly maintained by the extrinsic group of muscles, whereas the intrinsic muscles, they mainly alter the shape of the tongue. So the shape of the tongue, different shape of the tongue is brought about by the intrinsic group of muscles. So this is about the extrinsic and the intrinsic group of muscles. So regarding the extrinsic group of muscles, they are in total 5 in number. There are about 5 extrinsic group of muscle. They are: number 1 is called as the genioglossus. Number 1 is called as the genioglossus. Number second is the hyoglossus. Hyoglossus. Next comes the styloglossus. Next comes the styloglossus. Then there is the muscle from the soft palate which is called as the palatoglossus, and lastly a small muscle called as the chondroglossus. So these are the extrinsic group of muscles. The intrinsic group of muscles are named in order of their arrangement, like the longitudinal group of muscles. They are the longitudinal group of muscles, the transversus muscle, transversus linguale, the transversus muscles. Then next there is verticalis muscle which run vertically, verticalis muscles. So these are the intrinsic group of muscles. So firstly, we will study in detail about the extrinsic group of muscles. So among the 5 extrinsic group of muscles, as I have already told, the extrinsic muscles mainly maintain the position of the tongue. To firstly, the genioglossus muscle. This is the diagrammatic view showing all the extrinsic group of muscle. So the very first muscle which needs to be mentioned is the muscle genioglossus. So the word glossi refers to the tongue. So all the muscles take its origin from the different points and later they get inserted into the portion of the tongue. So the names are given according to the point of their origin. So the genioglossus is the first extrinsic group of muscle. The genioglossus is the large fan-shaped muscle taking its origin from the superior genial tubercles of the mandible, the superior genial tubercles of the symphysis menti of the mandible. From this point of origin, the huge fan-shaped muscle spreads out like a fan, and the lowermost fibers are seen to get inserted onto the hyoid bone, that is the body of the hyoid bone. So the lowermost fibers, they get inserted onto the body of the hyoid bone. So this is the hyoid bone. So the lowermost fibers reach the body of the hyoid bone. The uppermost fibers reach the tongue. The uppermost fibers reach the tongue, whereas the middle fibers, they are directed backwards to reach the muscle hyoglossus. The intermediate fibers, they pass deep to the hyoglossus and are continuous with the middle constrictor of the pharynx. So the middle fibers, they run deep to the hyoglossus to reach the middle constrictor of the pharynx. So this is about the insertion of the hyoglossus, sorry, the genioglossus. The genioglossus action is very important as the muscle genioglossus is called as the safety muscle of the tongue. It is called as the safety muscle of the tongue as it is the muscle which prevents the tongue from falling backwards. This muscle prevents the tongue from falling backward. The muscle protrudes the tip of the tongue and makes the dorsal surface concave from side to side. This muscle protrudes the tip of the tongue and maintains the concavity of the tongue. So this is about the action. The action of the genioglossus mainly saves the subject by preventing the backward fall of the tongue. So the backward falling of the tongue is prevented and the respiration, the airflow can be easily maintained by the intact action of the muscle genioglossus. Hence, this genioglossus muscle is called as the safety muscle of the tongue. Next, moving on to the second muscle, that is the hyoglossus. The hyoglossus is the important muscle. It is again the important muscle, extrinsic muscle of the tongue. So this hyoglossus muscle, as the name itself says, take its origin from the hyoid bone. It takes its origin from the hyoid bone, that is the body and the it takes its origin from the body and the upper surface of the greater cornu of the hyoid bone. So this is the greater cornu of the hyoid bone and part of the body which gives origin to the fibers of the muscle hyoglossus. This hyoglossus muscle is directed straight upward to reach the tongue. So the insertion of this hyoglossus muscle is onto the side of the tongue between the two muscles, that is the styloglossus and the inferior longitudinal muscle. So this insertion is very well appreciated in this atlas view. So we can make out the hyoglossus over here, which is taking origin from the hyoid bone, that is the greater cornu, and the part of the body of the hyoid bone directed upwards to reach the substance of the tongue. Within the tongue, the muscle, as we can observe carefully, within the substance of the tongue, this muscle is seen between close to the insertion in the tongue. The muscle hyoglossus is inserted between two muscles. Number one is the styloglossus laterally and the inferior longitudinal muscle medially. So close to the insertion, the hyoglossus muscle is seen between the styloglossus laterally and the inferior longitudinal muscle medially. So this is about the insertion of the hyoglossus. Regarding the action of the hyoglossus, the hyoglossus depresses its sides of the tongue and makes the dorsal surface convex. So the action is mainly the depression of the tongue and the convexity of the dorsal surface. So this is about the attachments and the actions of the muscle hyoglossus. Next, moving on to the third muscle, which is called as the styloglossus muscle. The styloglossus, as the name itself says, this styloglossus muscle is taking its origin from the styloid process. The origin, the muscle is seen to arise from the tip of the styloid process. It is seen to arise from the tip of the styloid process and also the ligament which is called as the stylomandibular ligament. Stylomandibular ligament. So this muscle takes its origin from the bone as well as the ligament. The styloid process The tip of the styloid process and the stylomandibular ligament gives origin to the muscle styloglossus. The muscle is directed downwards and forwards. The muscle is directed downwards and forwards to reach the substance of the tongue, and it is inserted onto the side of the tongues. Moving on to the actions of the styloglossus muscle. The styloglossus muscle retracts the tongue. It retracts the tongue backwards and upwards. So the action of this styloglossus muscle is opposite to that of the action of the genioglossus. That is, it is antagonistic to the action of the genioglossus. Genioglossus, as I have told before, is the muscle which protrudes the tip of the tongue, whereas the styloglossus is opposite to that, that is, it is involved in the retraction of the tongue. So this is about the attachments and action of the muscle styloglossus. Next, moving on to the muscle palatoglossus. Palatoglossus. So this palatoglossus muscle take its origin from the undersurface of the palatine aponeurosis. So the origin is from the palatine. The origin is from the palatine aponeurosis of the soft palate, and the insertion of this palatopharyngeus is onto the base of the tongue. So the insertion, the fibers are directed downwards to reach the side of the tongue in front of the sulcus terminalis. So the insertion of this muscle is in front of the sulcus terminalis of the tongue. So this is the insertion of the palatoglossus. The action of the palatoglossus, it is mainly involved, the palatoglossus muscle is mainly bringing about the elevation of the base of the tongue and thus narrows the oropharyngeal isthmus. So this is the important action regarding the palatoglossus. This palatoglossus muscle is involved in narrowing, it narrows the oropharyngeal isthmus. So the narrowing of the oropharyngeal isthmus is brought about by the palatoglossus by elevating the base of the tongue. So this is about the action of the muscle palatoglossus. So here also in this atlas view, we can just make out the muscle palatoglossus. This is the soft palate, as we can make out the muscle arising from the palatine aponeurosis directed downward to reach the tongue, and the insertion is in front of the sulcus terminalis. The muscle mainly elevates the base of the tongue and narrows the oropharyngeal isthmus. So the last muscle left out is the chondroglossus. So the fifth muscle of the tongue is called as the chondroglossus. This chondroglossus muscle is said to be the part of the hyoglossus muscle itself. They say that this chondroglossus muscle is the detached portion of the hyoglossus muscle, taking its origin from the part of the body, and the lesser cornu of the hyoid bone. So the origin of the chondroglossus is the body and the lesser cornu of the hyoid bone. This chondroglossus muscle is seen to get inserted onto the sides of the tongue. It is seen to get inserted onto the sides of the tongue. The action of this chondroglossus is mainly the depression. It depresses the sides of the tongue. So the muscle depresses the sides of the tongue. So this is about the action of the muscle chondroglossus. So basically the chondroglossus is the part of the hyoglossus itself. So that's all about all the 5 extrinsic muscles of the tongue. To wind up the extrinsic muscles of the tongue, as I have told, so the very first muscle is the genioglossus muscle from the superior genial tubercle to that of the tongue. The second muscle is the hyoglossus from the hyoid bone and the greater cornu and the body of the hyoid bone to the tongue. The styloglossus taking its origin from the tip of the styloid process and the stylomandibular ligament. The palatoglossus taking its origin from the palatine aponeurosis of the soft palate, and the fifth muscle, which is not seen here, is the chondroglossus, which is seen to be the part of the hyoglossus itself. So this is about the extrinsic muscles. The actions, as I've already told, the muscle genioglossus is called as the safety muscle, as this genioglossus muscle brings about the protrusion of the tip of the tongue. So it protrudes the tongue. So protrusion of the tongue is brought about by the muscle genioglossus. Retraction of the tongue is brought about the muscle styloglossus. Retraction of the tongue is brought about by the styloglossus. The palatoglossus elevates the base of the tongue. Elevation of the base of the tongue, thus it narrows the oropharyngeal isthmus. The muscle hyoglossus is making up the dorsal surface convex. So the convexity of the dorsal surface is brought about by the hyoglossus muscle, and chondroglossus, it depresses the sides of the tongue. So in short, these are the actions of the muscles of the tongue. So this is about the actions of the muscles of the tongue and its attachments. Next, moving on to the intrinsic group of muscles. Next, regarding the intrinsic muscles of the tongue. The intrinsic muscles of the tongue are the muscles which are seen within the substance of the tongue. These intrinsic muscles of the tongue are usually arranged in four pairs. Number one is the superior longitudinal muscle. Number second is the inferior longitudinal muscle. And then next comes the transversus linguae and the verticalis linguae, or transverse and the vertical group of muscles. So these are the four pairs of the intrinsic group of the muscles. All the muscles of the tongue, they are arranged on either side of the tongue, where the tongue is divided into two symmetrical halves by the fibrous septum, which is called as the median fibrous septum. So the median fibrous septum is the fibrous septum present within the substance of the tongue, dividing the tongue into the two equal halves. So to begin with, the very first muscle, the superior longitudinal muscle. The superior longitudinal muscle is seen to arise beneath the dorsal surface from the mucous membrane, and the muscle is getting inserted. This muscle is seen to get inserted onto the sides of the tongue. The next muscle is the inferior longitudinal muscle. The inferior longitudinal muscle is seen to take its origin again from the area beneath the mucous membrane, and the insertion is again over the insertion of this inferior longitudinal muscle is onto the anterior part of the median fibrous septum. The insertion of the inferior longitudinal muscle is over the anterior part of the median fibrous septum. The transversus muscle, the transversus linguae muscle, where the muscle fibers are arranged transversely, they take its origin from this fibrous septum, that is the median fibrous septum, and they tend to get inserted onto the sides of the tongue. Lastly, the vertical group of muscle, that is verticalis linguae, is again seen to arise from the dorsum of the tongue, and they are directed laterally for the insertion onto the sides of the tongue. So this is about the attachments. In short, all the intrinsic muscle, they take origin more or less from the undersurface or beneath the mucous membrane of the dorsal surface of the tongue. So I repeat, the origin of the intrinsic muscle is over the mucous membrane beneath the membrane, that is the mucous membrane of the tongue. The mucous membrane of the tongue beneath the mucous membrane of the dorsal surface of the tongue. So this is about the origin of all the muscles of the tongue. So except one muscle, that is the that is the transversus muscle. This transverse group of muscle is seen to take its origin from the median fibrous septum. So the origin of the transversus linguae is from the median fibrous septum. The median fibrous septum. Other than this transverse group of muscle, all the muscle is seen to take its origin from the mucous membrane under the substance of the tongue. So this is in short about the origin. All the muscles are more or less taking its insertion. They are inserted onto the sides of the tongue. Most all the intrinsic muscles, they tend to get inserted onto the side. So the insertion of all the intrinsic muscle is onto the insertion is on to the, it is over the sides of the tongue. Again, there is one exception, that is the muscle inferior longitudinal muscle. That is the muscle inferior longitudinal muscle. This inferior longitudinal muscle is getting inserted. The insertion of this inferior longitudinal muscle is over the anterior part of the median fibrous septum. The insertion of this inferior longitudinal muscle is over the anterior part of the median fibrous septum. So except these two muscles, that is the transversus muscle where the origin is from the median fibrous septum, and the inferior longitudinal muscle, the insertion is over the median longitudinal septum. These are the two exceptions, whereas rest all the muscles more or less the origin is from the undersurface of the dorsal surface and the insertion is onto the sides of the tongue. Lastly, moving on to the actions of this intrinsic group of muscle. Regarding the action, the superior longitudinal and the verticalis muscle, the verticalis linguae, these two muscles, they are involved in making the dorsal surface concave. The concavity of the dorsal surface is brought about by these two muscles, that is the superior longitudinal and the verticalis linguae muscle, vertical group of muscle. The inferior longitudinal muscle, this muscle brings about convexity of the dorsal surface, whereas the rest two muscle, that is the leftover muscle, the transversus muscle, that reduces the width of the tongue and increases the length. The transverse muscle reduces the width and increases the length of the tongue. So this is about the action of the intrinsic muscle. This is the section showing the interior of the muscle arrangement of the tongue, where we can make out the intrinsic group of muscle, that is the superior longitudinal muscle, the vertical and the transverse group of muscle, and also the inferior longitudinal muscle. So the inferior longitudinal muscle, which is seen here, the superior longitudinal muscle, and the vertical and the transverse group of muscle under the dorsum of the tongue. Other than that, we can also make out the extrinsic muscle such as the Genioglossus, the Styloglossus muscle, and also the Hyoglossus in this view. This is again the atlas view showing the cut section, showing the muscles of the tongue, as we can make out the Hyoglossus, the Genioglossus muscle, and the Styloglossus muscle. We can also make out the muscles arranged, that is the intrinsic group of muscles arranged under the dorsum of the tongue. Moving on to the arterial and the venous drainage of the tongue. This is the section showing the blood supply of the tongue. The arterial supply is chiefly by the lingual artery, which is the branch of the external carotid artery. So the arteries supplying the tongue is mainly the lingual artery. Then next comes the branch of the facial artery. The branches of the facial artery, which include the dorsal lingual artery and also the palatine branches, and also the ascending pharyngeal artery, which is the branch of the external carotid. So these are the arteries which supply the tongue. So I repeat, the arteries which supply the tongue mainly include the lingual artery. Then next comes the ascending palatine artery. the ascending palatine artery and the tonsillar branches, and lastly the arterial supply is also seen from the ascending pharyngeal artery, so this is about the arterial supply of the tongue. The venous drainage of the tongue is mainly divided into two categories. The venous drainage is mainly divided into two categories, that is the superficial veins and the deep veins. It is divided into the superficial veins and the deep vein. The superficial vein drain the tip and the undersurface of the tongue. So the superficial veins drain the tip of the tongue and the undersurface of the tongue, the deeper part of the tongue, and they tend to end into the internal jugular vein. They ends up in the internal jugular vein. So the superficial vein drains the tip and the undersurface of the tongue. They pass superficial to the hyoglossus muscle and they ends into the internal jugular vein. So this is about the superficial vein. There is deep group of vein also, the deep group of deep veins also. These deep veins drain the area of the dorsum. It drains the dorsum of the tongue. So the venous blood from the dorsum of the tongue, they accompany the lingual artery. They are seen accompanying the lingual artery and they terminate again into the internal jugular vein. So I repeat, the venous drainage of the tongue is mainly by the two sets of veins, that is the superficial veins and the deep veins. The superficial veins accompany the hypoglossal nerve and ends in the internal jugular vein, and these superficial veins take up the tip and the undersurface of the tongue, whereas the deep group of veins drain the dorsum of the tongue and they passes through the accompany the lingual artery to terminate into the internal jugular vein. Ultimately, all the venous drainage is into the internal jugular vein. So this is about the arterial and the venous drainage of the tongue. Moving on to the nerve supply of the tongue. The nerve supply of the tongue represents the motor nerve supply and the sensory nerve supply. The motor nerve supply supplies the muscles. All the muscles of the tongue are supplied by the hypoglossal nerve. All the muscles of the tongue are supplied by the hypoglossal nerve except one muscle, that is the palatoglossus. Except the muscle palatoglossus, which receives its nerve supply from the cranial part of the accessory nerve via the vagus. So this is the exception. The exception muscle is the palatoglossal muscle, which receives its nerve supply from the cranial part of the accessory nerve. So this is about the somatomotor nerve supply, that is the nerve supply supplying the muscles. Moving on to the sensory nerve supply. The sensory nerve supply is again categorized into two, that is the general sensation and the special sensation. The special sensation is mainly the taste and the general sensation includes the touch, pressure, etc. So the general sensation of the tongue, the general sensory supply of the tongue is different in different parts. Regarding the anterior two-third of the tongue, from the anterior two-third, the general sensation is by the lingual nerve. The general sensory nerve is the lingual nerve, and the taste sensation is carried by the chorda tympani nerve. Chorda tympani nerve, which is the branch of the facial nerve, which is the branch of the seventh cranial nerve, that is the facial nerve. The special sensory, that is the chorda tympani nerve, it receives the special sensation, that is the taste sensation, from the entire anterior two-third except the vallet papillae, which lies in front of the sulcus terminalis. So the special sense of the taste except the valid papillae over here is by the chorda tympani. Moving on to the posterior one-third of the tongue. From the posterior one-third, including the valid papillae, the both general and special sensation is carried out by the ninth cranial nerve, that is the glossopharyngeal nerve. That is the glossopharyngeal nerve. So the glossopharyngeal nerve carries both special and the general sensation of the posterior one-third of the tongue plus the taste sensation from the valid papillae as well. Next, moving on to the posterior most part, that is the area of the valleculae of the tongue. This area is supplied by the internal laryngeal branch of the superior laryngeal nerve from the vagus. So, the posterior one, that is the posterior most part of the valleculae, is supplied by the 10th cranial nerve, that is the vagus, by its branch, that is the internal laryngeal nerve from the superior laryngeal nerve, which is the branch of the vagus nerve. So the anterior 2/3 is supplied by the 7th cranial nerve, the posterior 1/3 is supplied by the 9th cranial nerve, and the valleculae, which is the posterior most part, is supplied by the 10th cranial nerve. So this is about the sensory supply of the tongue. This picture shows the sensory innervation, the special sensory innervation, that is the taste sensation carried away, that is the chorda tympani nerve, which I have told you, which is the branch of the facial nerve, carries a taste sensation from the anterior 2/3 except the valid papillae. The posterior 1/3 of the tongue, including the valid papillae, is carrying the taste sensation by the glossopharyngeal nerve, whereas the posterior most part of the tongue, the sensation is carried by the vagus, which is the 10th cranial nerve through the branch, that is the internal laryngeal nerve. This is the atlas view showing the secretomotor supply to the tongue, that is the secretomotor supply to the anterior lingual glands. The supply to the anterior lingual gland is by the secretomotor pathway, that is the preganglionic fibers. The preganglionic fibers is from the preganglionic fibers arise from the superior salivatory nucleus. The preganglionic fibers arise from the superior salivatory nucleus of the brainstem, which pass successively through the facial nerve here, which pass through the facial nerve, from the facial nerve to the branch of the facial nerve, that is the chorda tympani, and the lingual nerve to reach into the submandibular ganglion. So the relay station is over the submandibular ganglion, which is seen in front of the hyoglossus muscle. The postganglionic fibers reach the glands via the lingual nerve. So this is about the secretomotor pathway. I repeat, the secretomotor pathway to the anterior lingual gland is from the superior salivatory nucleus. From the superior salivatory nucleus comes the facial nerve. The facial nerve sensation is carried out through its branch, that is the chorda tympani nerve. Chorda tympani nerve. From the chorda tympani nerve to the lingual nerve, which relays in the submandibular ganglion. Submandibular ganglion. So, the submandibular ganglion is the relay station. From the submandibular ganglion, the postganglionic fibers reach the anterior lingual gland through this, that is the lingual nerve itself. So, this is about the secretomotor pathway of the tongue. Next, moving on to the lymphatic drainage of the tongue. The lymphatics emerging is grouped into four sets, that is the apical vessels, the marginal vessels, the central vessels and the basal vessels. So the lymphatics are divided into four sets, that is the apical number 1, the marginal vessels number 2, the basal vessels and the central vessels here. So the vessels, that is the lymphatics from the tip and the inferior surface of the tongue, the lymphatics from the tip and the inferior surface of the tongue is drained into the submental group of lymph nodes. From the submental group of lymph nodes, they reach the jugulo-omohyoid group of lymph nodes. So this is about the lymphatics from the tip and the central portion, whereas the lymphatics from the marginal portion of the anterior two-third, the lymphatics from the marginal portion, that is the sides of the anterior two-third of the tongue, they drain into the submandibular group of lymph nodes. They drain into the submandibular group of lymph nodes and then into later on, which drains into the ultimately reaches this jugulo-omohyoid lymph nodes. Thirdly, the central vessels, that is the central portion of the anterior two-third, the central portion of the anterior two-third drains mainly into the, they pass direct downwards to reach the deep cervical group of lymph nodes. The central vessels mainly drain into the deep cervical group of lymph nodes. And lastly, the basal vessels, that is the lymphatics from the root of the tongue and the posterior one-third of the trunk over here, drains into the deep cervical group of lymph nodes. They drain into the deep cervical group of lymph nodes. So I repeat, the lymphatics from the tongue and the inferior surface reach the submental group of lymph nodes. The lymphatics from the sides of the tongue reach the submandibular group of lymph nodes. The lymphatics from the central portion of the tongue reach the deep cervical group of lymph nodes, whereas the lymphatics, that is the basal lymphatics from the root of the tongue and the posterior one-third of the tongue, they drain into the again the deep cervical group of lymph nodes. So this is about the lymphatic drainage. Lastly, moving on to the development of the tongue, the embryological aspect of the tongue, that is the mucous membrane of the tongue, develops from the primitive pharynx. The tongue develops from the floor of the primitive pharynx in relation to the pharyngeal arches. The anterior two-third of the tongue develops as the two endodermal swelling, which are called as the lingual swellings. These lingual swellings develop into the anterior two-third of the tongue. Between the first and the second arch lies the tuberculum impar. The posterior one-third of the tongue develops from the hypobronchial eminence, which is again the endodermal thickening. The hypobronchial eminence makes up the posterior one-third of the tongue, and the posterior most part of the tongue is developed from the fourth pharyngeal arch, that is the posterior most part of the hypobronchial eminence. So the anterior two-third of the tongue is developed from the lingual swelling coming from the first pharyngeal arch. The posterior one-third is developed from the hypobronchial eminence coming from the second, third and the fourth pharyngeal arches, second, third and the fourth pharyngeal arches, and the posterior most part of the tongue is from the caudal most part of the hypobronchial eminence, that is again from the fourth pharyngeal arch. So this is about the development of the mucous membrane of the tongue. Regarding the muscles, development of the muscles, all the muscles of the tongue. The muscles of the tongue is developed from the occipital myotomes. They are developed from the occipital myotomes. Occipital myotomes, which at first are closely related to the developing hindbrain, and later on they migrate around the pharynx and enter the tongue. The migration of this myotome is carried along with its nerve supply, that is the 12th cranial nerve, the hypoglossal nerve. So this is about the development of the muscles and also the mucous membrane. So this was the end of the video regarding the muscles of the tongue. So we have studied in detail about the muscles of the tongue, their blood supply, the nerve supply of the tongue in detail, and also a note on the development of the tongue in this video for today. Thank you.